introduce Daniel Mattingly. It's a great pleasure to have him here. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Yale. His research focuses on the politics of authoritarian regimes, historical, political, economy, and China. He has published in many prestigious journal articles in political science, including World Politics, Comparative Political Studies, Journal of Politics, and many others. I decided not to list all of them. His book, The Art of Political Control in China, published by Cambridge in 2020, which I encourage you all to read. It's a fantastic book. Received the Best Book Award from the Democracy and Autocracy section of American Political Science Association, and was the winner of the Getty Smith International Book Prize, and was named one of the best books of 2020 by Foreign Affairs. So you should really read it. Here, I think that today he's going to give a talk on the military-party relations in China, which is sort of part of the second book project that he's working on. All right, Dan, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Jen, so much for having me here and inviting me to give this talk. And I'm just so excited to be virtually at McGill. It's good. It's about to start snowing here, so I feel like I get a little bit of the Montreal experience by proxy. And I'm just delighted to give the talk. So I have as Jen mentioned in her very generous introduction, this is a project that I'm going to start sharing my slides here. That comes out of my second book project, which is about the role of the military in elite politics. And one of the things that I was interested in, oh no, it's advancing automatically, isn't it? There we go. Okay. So I think one of the reasons that the military is interesting is that it's this institution that plays a role both in domestic politics and in international politics. So we were, talking just before the talk about the, really, tragic events unfolding in Ukraine today. So the military obviously plays a key role in helping nations project power and go to war, but militaries also play an important role in domestic politics. And I think in the case of China, this isn't something that has been studied too extensively in the recent literature, especially in comparative politics. There's lots of great work on the PLA, a lot of great work in international relations on the role of the PLA in international politics. And there's just less in comparative politics about what's the role of the PLA in domestic politics and how does the PLA kind of bridge this divide between being a really important international and domestic institution, not just in China, but for a lot of autocracies. And so the bottom line of the talk that I'm going to argue today, and I'll try to keep the talk relatively brief so we can have hopefully a nice discussion after for as long as people want to stick around. So the bottom line that I'm going to argue in this talk is that that the military sort of poses a dilemma for the leaders of authoritarian regimes, where they have to try to balance between foreign threats, external threats from great powers that might threaten a country's territorial integrity, and also domestic threats. You could think of, in the case of authoritarian regimes, both the threat of popular movements, but even more important than that, the threat of other elites in the regime trying to challenge someone in the regime for power. And so this paper is really about how do autocrats try to adjudicate between these two things. This is something that I think the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, it's something that the leaders talk about a fair amount explicitly. So in Xi Jinping's centenary speech in July of 2021, when he talked about the military, he quoted, Mao's famous aphorism that the party has to command the gun, the party has to control the gun. And he talked about two important things. First, we must enhance the political loyalty of the armed forces, in this case to the party, and strengthen them through the training of competent personnel. So Xi Jinping, I think, himself in some of these speeches does think about this problem of we want a military that's loyal to the party domestically, but that can also is competent enough that it can help the country and the party project power internationally. And actually, earlier this week in the People's Daily, he echoed this. There was a series of articles on what is it? Not like the 10 clarities, or it's not the 10 comprehensive anyway, where Xi Jinping was also talking about the People's Daily was also talking about this need to have a military that's both loyal to the party and extremely competent. So this isn't something that just the Chinese Communist Party faces. I think it's a more general dilemma or trade-off that regimes have to think about. On the one hand, they want a loyal military, especially a loyal when it comes to trying to fend off elite challenges or coups. So the armed forces historically across the world in the post-war, post-1945 era have led 9 in 10 successful coups. In the case of the Chinese Communist Party, where there hasn't been a successful coup, you could still think of elite challenges like Lin Biao's challenge to Mao, or Deng Xiaoping's challenge to Hua Guofeng. In each case, the military played a key pivotal role in adjudicating which civilian elite within the coalition won. And of course, the military is also really important in successful, bottom-up mass protest movements and revolutions. So if the military remains loyal to the regime, these movements are less likely to succeed. At the same time, regimes want a competent armed forces that can help the regime project power around the world. So, even the last time China fought in a significant ground war was the conflict with Vietnam in the late 1970s. The ability of the PLA to project power in the South China Sea or across the Taiwan Strait is still essential, certainly in the eyes of the party, for maintaining the country's territorial integrity and also projecting power. So how do you solve this problem? Well, of course, to a certain extent, to the extent you can, you just want people who are loyal and competent, right? That would be the kind of ideal, is to have officers, especially if you're thinking about, you want the elite officer corps to be full of officers who are really good at fighting wars, but also really loyal to the party. So you could think of someone like, so this is of course Xi Jinping on the right, and Zhang Youxia, who's on the left. This is a pretty unsmiling picture of him. There's like a grim picture of the two of them. Zhang Youxia actually has like some great pictures of him smiling. He's not quite this grim most of the time, but it's a formal picture, so he's pretty serious. And Zhang is somebody who you could think of, he has some markers of loyalty. So Zhang's father is from the exact same part of Shanxi as Xi Zhongxun, as Xi Jinping's father. And so Zhang and Xi have this history that goes back to both of their fathers' childhoods. And so they're both, princelings, essentially. Can you still hear me? For some reason, my speaker is switching. Okay, good. And at the same time as he has these markers of loyalty, he's another princeling like Xi Jinping. He has, his father comes from the same area, so they have this nice kind of like blood connection. Zhang Youxia is also somebody who has combat experience. He, in the late 1970s, in 1978 through 80, he was on the front lines in Vietnam, commanding ground level troops in Vietnam. So he's somebody who has markers of loyalty, but also potentially of competence. He has this kind of battlefield experience that you might argue would be pretty valuable for a leader of a military. But in practice, a lot of times you don't have, the army's not filled with people like Zhang Youxia. The PLA isn't just full of a ton of Zhang Youxias. Instead, the party has to manage a kind of trade-off between loyalty and competence. So the basic argument is that in times of domestic threat, especially when there's a lot of pressure from other elites to potentially, when there's the threat of an elite challenge, you can think about, in the case of China, in the lead up to the 1989 protests, there was a split between the conservatives and the more liberal faction of the party, which is a contributing factor to these protests. And in these times, when there's a potential internal threat, the party wants to make sure that it has control over the military, and so emphasizes the promotion of loyal officers in times of domestic threat. Whereas in times of external threat, you can think about something like the third Taiwan Straits crisis in the 1990s, when the United States was pressuring China in the Taiwan Strait, is a time when the party has incentives to emphasize competence in the selection of its military officers. So the basic empirical contribution of this paper is, I have collected a new data set that has about 10,000 appointments to the People's Liberation Army of China. This is the first large-scale data set of an autocratic military, at least that I'm aware of. And I think it contributes to one of a relatively small number of studies of the role of the PLA in domestic politics. I think, especially given its historical importance, it's something that merits more study. The key findings of this are that promotion to these high politically important ranks depends on ties to leader and the markers of loyalty, as well as training and combat experience, which you could think of as markers of competence. But the party can't always just kind of equally focus on these two things. The wrinkle here is that in periods when there's significant domestic threat, they place more emphasis on leader ties, on loyalty, and in periods of foreign threat, more emphasis on training and combat experience, markers of competence. And this is kind of, I think, part of a growing work that calls into question some of the fundamental pieces of the framework that we usually think of for authoritarian politics. If you think of the work, for example, by colleague down the hall, Malance Folik, on the role of the military in authoritarian regimes, they usually highlight something that's called the guardianship dilemma. And the idea of the guardianship dilemma is that authoritarian regimes face a choice between having a strong military that could potentially challenge the regime from power, but could protect it from outside threats, or a relatively weak military that might be unable to launch a coup and threaten the regime from within, but also is less able to protect the regime from outside threats. That's a kind of typical trade-off that's highlighted. I'm actually highlighting a different trade-off in the case of a relatively well-established institutionalized regime like the PLA in China. And my argument is that in these sorts of regimes, the regime instead tries to trade off between sort of competence and loyalty in order to meet domestic threats or external threats. So I'm highlighting a different trade-off than this literature on the guardianship dilemma. So the PLA has historically played an important role in domestic politics in China. So as the great Susan Shirk has written, it's an army that has been crucial for victory in party power struggles, especially elite power struggles, in a way that support of civilian government officials, party officials has not necessarily been. So, and I think this especially holds true in the Mao and Deng eras, when the role of the PLA in elite politics was pretty clear. And even though the PLA was clearly subordinate to the party, and the party did essentially command the gun, support of the PLA was nevertheless crucial for elites, for civilian elites, trying to win political battles with each other. So you could think about, for example, Mao's ability to coerce other elites and undertake the mass purge that was the Cultural Revolution. Partly he was able to do that because of his strong base of support within the PLA, because he had the support of Lin Biao, and the PLA, which was where the Cultural Revolution really began, was in the ranks of the PLA when Lin Biao in the early 1960s started to distribute the little red book of Maoist aphorisms. And since then, the PLA has been pretty crucial in internal party struggles. You can think about the rise of Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s. The PLA played a key role in pushing aside first the Gang of Four in 1976 after Mao's death, and then Mao's chosen successor Hua Guofeng was also pushed aside, essentially by Ye Jianying and the PLA. In both of those cases, civilian support was also crucial, but as Shirk notes, it was the military that was pivotal in these power struggles. And the role of the PLA more recently, I think, has been less clear and less studied. But as I'm going to argue, I think it's also crucial for understanding the strength of Xi Jinping and the weakness of some of his predecessors, like Hu Jintao. So if you want to understand why Hu Jintao was pretty constrained, I think partly it comes down to understanding how weak control Hu Jintao had over the military, and why Xi Jinping is so strong and was able to undertake a far-reaching corruption crackdown that purged some of his potential political rivals from the party, as well as corruption. His base of support in the PLA is also important to understand. So the key outcome that I'm going to focus on in this paper and the rest of the talk is promotion to the Central Committee. Central Committee has about 200 full members and over 300 members altogether, including full and alternate members. The PLA officers make up about a fifth of the Central Committee. So, I mean, if you if you kind of like look really closely at this picture and squint a little bit, you can see that there are about 1 in 5 people in this picture are PLA officers. This is a group photo of the Central Committee with the Politburo in the front. And I'm going to look at two sets of key explanatory variables. The first are training and combat experience as markers of competence. And partly this is inspired by Deng Xiaoping himself, who talked about 2 different things that he wanted to see in PLA officers. The first is battlefield experience, which Deng called in his kind of like earthy way, touching the tiger's backside. So Deng was interested in his case, for example, rotating officers in the late in the 1978-1979 rather conflict with Vietnam, rotating officers through the front line in order so they had some combat experience and had a chance to touch the tiger's backside, as Deng put it. And he also cared about college and military training. Now that we're not at war, how are we going to test our officers? Deng said, how else if not through education and training? So the first thing, in order to understand competence, I'm going to look at whether officers had combat experience and education and training. In an ideal world, I would be able to have more information on officers' performance and like training exercises and that sort of thing, but that's sort of not available to us on the outside. But I think using some of the markers that the party itself talks about as key markers for understanding competence. The other key kind of explanatory variable I'm looking at are ties to the top Paramount leader. And so I'm going to look in the post Mao era, and so here we're looking at ties to Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping. And the key here are these leaders had chances to develop ties to PLA leaders through working as provincial, prefecture, and even county civilian leaders. Whereas provincial, prefecture, and county civilian leaders, each of these leaders served on local military committees, which allowed them to build networks in the PLA. So through knowing the history of these leaders and when they served as provincial leaders, I can then reconstruct which leaders they served, which military leaders they served with on which committees, so I can understand like how they were directly tied to military leaders. So to examine this, I built this new data set of this top echelon of PLA leaders, including the deputy field commanders and above. I have constructed these chronological professional biographies of each of these leaders based on open source data from that's published by the CCP organization department and through other sources. I have a set of rich individual characteristics, everything from people's birthplace to birth year to each of the major posts that they held through their career. So overall, this data set has about 10,000 appointments of about 1,200 officers. About 700 of them served in this post-Mao era. And so for this first set, I'm just going to kind of look at basically correlations, and I'll explain. I'll walk through this just so the Greek letters here don't seem too intimidating. Basically, what I'm looking at is what's correlated with what's being promoted. So that's the outcome I'm looking at, is whether someone was promoted. And in the data, I've created an indicator for whether someone was connected to a CMC chairman, an indicator for post-secondary education, and also an indicator for combat experience. And also we'll include some kind of controls in these models. We shouldn't interpret this in a causal way, but that will just help us help me kind of like condition on some of these control variables. I should add, by the way, I meant to say this at the beginning, that I'm also happy to take questions or comments or answer anything on the way, kind of depending how you want to kind of like monitor things. So I thought I'd pause just for a second to see if there are any questions so far, either about and then I can dive into some of the results, but about
flexible. If I guess if somebody has clarification questions, they could ask. This is a good opportunity to ask. I will pay attention to any kind of raise hand function if they want to ask question. Otherwise, we can continue.
Okay.
Sorry, Dan. Actually, I forgot. Did you? I got distracted with the read room and making sure nobody disturbing us. Do you have a time period that you're looking at in terms of your universal cases?
Oh, that's a great point. That's a very important point. Yeah, so I'm looking at 1981 to 2016 for
Okay.
these cases. So in 1980, Deng Xiaoping became effectively the paramount leader in 1978, but it wasn't until 1981 that he formally became chairman of the Central Military Commission. And in 1981 was also the year that Hua Guofeng was officially stripped of his posts. So there's that 3-year period where, I can add that into the analysis. It doesn't make much of a difference, but my argument here is like Deng Xiaoping really became fully paramount leader in 1981 when he became chair of the Central Military Commission. And the data stopped in 2016 because there was a major reorganization of the PLA in 2016 that just makes it harder to compare positions from 2016 to 2017. But I also have data on those positions. So just looking here at correlations, and this is really the only kind of table that I'll show you, which it's not too much fun to look at tables in these kinds of talks. But the idea is first I'm going to look at so the outcome here is whether or not somebody was included in promoted to the Central Committee, conditional on becoming a deputy military region commander and above. So of that kind of pool of about 700 officers, about 1 in 5 end up being promoted to the Central Committee, about 20%. Having a tie, serving together with a civilian leader on one of these regional military commands, about doubles an individual's likelihood of being promoted to the Central Committee. So if you think about 20% of officers in general make it onto in this pool of elite 3 and 4-star officers, about 1 in 5 of them make it all the way onto the party Central Committee. It about doubles your chance of making it onto the Central Committee if you have a tie to a top leader. And also in this period, and a lot of this variation is driven by the early period when the level of education in this PLA was relatively low in the 1980s. It also really helps to have college or military academy training in this period. So it doesn't quite double it, but it increases it by more than 50%, especially. And again, a lot of this is driven by the early period when PLA officers are less well educated. The other thing that really, really helps is having combat experience. So it more than doubles your chance of making it onto the Central Committee if you have combat experience, especially this post-revolutionary combat experience in the war in Korea, combat experience with Vietnam, or the border war with India. These things increase your chances of making it onto the Central Committee, conditional on being at this level, from about 20% to closer to 40-some%. So so you can kind of put all these things in one model, and they all remain statistically significant and about the same size. The substantive estimate, for each of them goes down a little bit, but it's still the effect of each of these things is quite large. So in general, there does seem to be evidence that across all these officers, the party cares about loyalty and it cares about competence. So if you think about the first kind of theoretical prediction being, ideally you want to have officers who are both. Like the data in general kind of bears out the idea that the party wants loyal and competent officers, which is, maybe interesting, but not necessarily extraordinarily surprising. I think the more interesting, there are a couple more interesting ways to cut this, though. The first is to look at factional ties by leader. So if you think about which of the paramount leaders of China, so here are the 4 post-Mao paramount leaders: Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping, from left to right. So which paramount leaders generals are most likely to be promoted? So here's promotion to the Central Committee by whether or not generals in kind of Deng's faction, Jiang, who was Xi's faction, in other words, whether or not they served alongside of one of these leaders in a military committee position. For Deng Xiaoping, he has a lot of people because he was the commander of the Second Field Army during the Chinese Civil War. In general, right, it helps. This is for promotion to the Central Committee, especially for Deng and for Xi. The other estimates aren't statistically significant. You see the confidence interval for Hu's quite wide, just because he didn't serve with that many people on these military committees. If you look at promotion to the full general's rank, on the other hand, you see like a pretty even more striking pattern where there's really, the estimate for Hu is like actually negative, but it's the confidence interval is very wide. So for either of these measures, whether it's promotion to the Central Committee or promotion to full general, Hu Jintao's generals don't fare very well, whereas Xi Jinping's generals are much more likely to be promoted, even when compared to generals connected to Deng or Jiang. Which I think it's at least it's some indication. This is not something that the paper is really focused on, but it's something that the book talks about more. I think this ability to get kind of your people in the PLA into key positions is really important for understanding leaders' power. So, for example, Hu Jintao's lack of coercive power, I would argue, is one thing that really constrained him and made it so that he couldn't crack down on corruption in the same way that Xi Jinping did, because he was vulnerable to an elite challenge if he tried to move against other members of, especially the Politburo Standing Committee, because he didn't have the backing necessarily of key military leaders. So this is Hu Jintao with the two vice chairs of the Central Military Commission, the top decision-making body for the military. These are the two top military commanders under Hu Jintao, Guo Boxiang and Xu Caihou, both of whom were later purged in the corruption crackdown, but both of them were actually appointed not by Hu Jintao, but by his predecessor, Jiang Zemin, who held on to the post of Central Military Commission chairman for an extra 2 years, almost an extra 2 years after he gave up his party post. And that allowed Jiang Zemin to consolidate his control in the military, and I think really undermine Hu Jintao. So I think, as a kind of side note to the general arguments in this paper, I think this is an interesting potential implication for understanding, why was it that Hu Jintao was weak, and how is it that Xi Jinping was strong? So now for the last part, and I don't want to talk for too much longer, is trying to unpack this idea that in periods of domestic threat, the party emphasizes loyalty. In periods of leaders emphasize loyalty. In periods of foreign threat, leaders are more likely to focus on competence. So I'm going to define here a domestic threat as a period in which there's a significant elite split, or they're in this period of kind of trying to consolidate power right after an elite split. And I would argue that there are two periods where this was the case. First, in this period of the 13th Party Congress, which saw the demotion of Hu Yaobang following the 1986 protests. It saw the 1989 protests and the demotion of Zhao Ziang. This was a pretty significant period in the post-Mao era of domestic threat, because there were both popular movements, and these popular movements were to some degree exacerbated or even caused by elite splits. And so the party and leaders like Deng Xiaoping were really worried about ensuring the loyalty of the military, arguably. The other period was this period right after the Bolshoi incident of 2012. So I would argue the 18th Party Congress, Xi Jinping's first Congress, was also a period of significant domestic threat, because this was the period where the party had to really start to clean up the mess of the Hu Jintao era, and especially clean up the mess of the Bolshoi incident. So for those of you who aren't China specialists, right, the Bolshoi incident, just to jog your memory, was in 2012. This Politburo member, who's the person on the left in this picture on this right. The picture on the right is Bolshoi, this pretty charismatic politician in the city of Chongqing. He was a member of the 25-person Politburo, which is the elite decision-making body in the party. And he was aiming to make it onto the Politburo Standing Committee, which now 7 members, then 9 members at the time. And he actually probably wanted to try to displace Xi Jinping as the chosen successor to Hu Jintao. And so right before this transition, there was this kind of crazy series of events, right, where Bolshoi's wife murdered this businessman. This was exposed, and it led to the police chief of the city that Bo was mayor of fleeing to the consulate, and it ended up kind of exposing this elite party rift. So these, I would argue, are the two key periods of domestic threat. So basically, I'm going to use the kind of same framework and just use an interaction for whether or not someone is promoted, and I'm going to interact that with whether or not they're eligible to be promoted during one of these periods of domestic threat. The idea is I'm just want to kind of separate out promotion during periods of domestic threat and other periods of time. So do factional ties to leaders matter more in periods of significant domestic political threat? So this is the estimate of what's the effect of being connected to a leader on your chance of being promoted to the Central Committee. So you can see on the left here, being connected to a leader during one of these periods of high domestic threat was strongly associated with being promoted to the Central Committee. It increased your chances of being promoted by about 40%. In periods of low domestic threat, in other words, outside of these periods, it wasn't strongly correlated with being promoted to the Central Committee. So it was the estimate here is like closer to 0 during this period. So it's pretty, so the correlation here is at least consistent with the idea that during periods of domestic threat, the party really wants to emphasize having PLA leaders who are connected to the top leader. Outside of these periods of domestic threat, it seems to matter less. The second key piece of this argument is understanding foreign political threats. So I'm arguing here that in the paper that foreign threats are periods of escalating military tension, especially with an adversary that could threaten a country's territorial integrity, right? So, small, so like arguably, when China has kind of they're escalating military tensions with Vietnam or the Philippines over the South China Sea. Does that count as plausibly threatening China's territorial integrity? Less so than when they're increasing tensions with the United States. So what I'm really focusing here in this period is the third Taiwan Straits crisis in the late 1990s, where the United States, sent a carrier group through the Taiwan Strait and, kind of exposed the fact or made clear the fact that China at the time would not have been able to respond militarily. And also the Hainan Island incident of 2001, where there was this kind of crash between a Chinese fighter jet and a US reconnaissance plane that was then forced to land on Hainan Island. So again, I'm going to look at this as kind of these key periods of foreign threat. I'm happy to send the paper to kind of show how I coded these. And the question here is, does combat experience matter more in these significant periods of foreign threat? I was arguing that, especially in the post-80s period, combat experience is really important. And we see a similar kind of pattern here, where there's in periods of high foreign threat, the military, the PLA, the party really prizes promoting officers with significant combat experience. On the right here, you see in periods of low foreign threat, combat experience is still a positive, but it matters less than in periods of high foreign threat. And this is, if you look at the interaction, the difference in these effects is statistically significant. So to sum up, what I'm arguing in this paper is that there's a foreign domestic threat dilemma that I think has not been appreciated in the study, especially of authoritarian politics, where parties want to emphasize loyalty and especially factional ties to individual leaders during periods of domestic threat. But during periods of foreign threat, training, past experience, combat experience, education matters more. And so to some extent, leaders have to trade off between these two domestic threats as much as they would like to just weigh these things equally the rest of the time. And I think in the bigger picture too, and just to wrap up, like thinking about the book project, I wouldn't argue that there's any likelihood in the near future that the military itself would undertake, a military coup to remove the party or remove Xi Jinping from power. So I think at the core of it, there are a bunch of institutions that ensure that the military will remain powerful to the party, from these kind of Leninist institutions like the Central Military Commission and these party branches or party cells that stretch all the way down to the company level in the PLA. So I don't think that there's, so the military seems likely to remain loyal to the party, but it still can be important for struggle powers within the party itself. So you think about like elite power struggles, the fact that Xi Jinping has been able to install, especially early in his tenure, a lot of leaders who in the PLA who are loyal to him was, I would argue, one key factor that helped him accumulate power. In a similar way, if we want to understand why Hu Jintao was so weak, Hu Jintao's inability to do the same because he was kind of undercut by Jiang Zemin partly explains his inability to consolidate power. So I'd like to stop there and thank all of you for sitting through that, and in addition to sitting through those exciting, unfortunate interruptions, and happy to take questions or have a conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Dan, for this very interesting talk.